World War II guns being used in Ukraine. Relics fighting in the modern war. One could say that war never ends. For some weapons, their uses also seem to never end. Firearms produced for World War II can still be seen in today's front lines, still on par with their modern counterparts. Some of these are century-old designs, constructed for completely different warfare and conditions, yet pulled from their racks and still serving their main purposes. It's not unique, however, only to contemporary battles, campaigns, and operations to utilize old equipment. World War I saw usage of designs 40 or 50 years old. As it was anachronistic to use single-shot bolt-action rifles in World War I, it was the same as using multi-turreted tanks of the interwar period in World War II. There were instances on the battlefield where soldiers with old, worn-out assault rifles like the MP-44 were next to rocket-propelled anti-tank launchers. After World War II ended, there was simply huge stocks of various weaponry remaining. Rifles, submachine guns, anti-tank launchers, pistols, grenades, mines, bombs, all the weapons that were massively produced had to be put to storage. They wouldn't need to wait long for reuse though. The Korean War broke out in 1950, a mere 5 years after the end of World War II, only to be fully utilized again on all sides, along with the more modern ones. Later wars were no exception. During the second half of the 20th century, many wars were fought with a similar mix of World War II weapons and contemporary designs. As the technology progressed, however, so did these outdated and worn-out weapons become less visible in the ranks. Proliferation of assault rifles like the AK-47 made submachine guns and old rifles be completely pushed aside and practically useless in comparison. However, it didn't mean that those weapons would completely die away. Stocks were and still are kept. The world's superpowers still keep their old weapon stocks, for the second-line troops and as a reserve. Thousands of rifles of all calibers and types are stored away, a legacy of the Cold War arms race. After the political turmoil of Euromaidan protests in February of 2014, a war broke out in Donbass. In the twist of events, the understaffed Ukrainian army launched a so-called anti-terrorist operation in eastern Ukraine. Opposing them were the local militias supported overtly and covertly by the Russian Federation. Their initial equipment and weapons would range from helmets and baseball bats, but would be upgraded to include modern rifles, tanks, artillery rockets, and rocket launchers. One antique weapon would return to service on both sides early on, the late 19th century Mosin Nagant rifle, carried and used in Donbass by the pro-Russian separatist forces. This rifle was designed from 1882 to 1891, adopted in service in the Russian Empire, and saw service in many wars up to present day. It's a bolt-action, 5-shot internal magazine-fed rifle, chambering 7.62 by 54mm cartridges. Usually fed by a stripper clip, it has a good range and accuracy. It was made in many variants, including carbines and sniper rifles. It served well through World War I and World War II, used by all sides on the Eastern Front. It's a crude and durable weapon, capable of dealing an impressive amount of damage over long distances. It was this rifle that had served one of the most renowned World War II Soviet snipers, Vasily Zaitsev, a man credited with over 225 enemy kills. He was using a Mosin Nagant M1891 rifle, fitted with a PU scope. The Mosin Nagant was produced in over 37 million copies and served many armies. Even with the advancement of sniper rifles and other infantry weapons, this rifle is still a potent and dangerous adversary. Another interesting weapon, slightly younger than the Mosin Nagant, is the historic Maxim machine gun. The PM M1910 is a water-cooled medium machine gun, chambering the same 7.62 by 54mm cartridge, belt-fed. It has a rate of fire of some 600 rounds per minute, featuring a metal shield with a two-wheeled carriage. It was used extensively in both world wars. During its lifetime, it was modernized several times over, improving ease of use and performance in the field. It was common to see Soviet infantry advancing while being covered by Maxim gunfire. One of the modernizations saw a change to the water cooler cap, making it bigger to allow the option of adding snow as a quick coolant. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense took advantage of the tens of thousands of these machine guns in their storage. In 2016, they were officially adopted into the armed forces and saw use in the war in Donbass. With the Russian invasion in 2022, these machine guns were more visible, being distributed to the territorial defense of Ukraine as well. Even though the Maxim gun cannot compete with modern medium machine guns like the PKM, it's still deadly and potent, capable of providing steady and constant volleys of fire over large distances. The submachine guns were seeing their full potential during World War II. Close combat inside Stalingrad was one of the major showcases of how short weapons with a good rate of fire and large ammo count could make a difference over the cumbersome long rifles. There were entire Soviet units which, when crossing into Stalingrad, would change their rifles for submachine guns. That would increase their firepower drastically and give them a fighting edge in the battle where buildings were fought over several times in a day. The PPSH-41, the most produced submachine gun of World War II, is a magazine-fed stamped steel weapon designed to be simple, cheap, and effective. It saw extensive use in the Soviet Army and in some conflicts after World War II. It can be fed with a stick magazine of 35 rounds or a drum magazine, which has a capacity of 71 rounds. It uses 7.62 by 25mm Tokoraph cartridges. It was so effective and efficient that the captured firearms were enviously kept by the German soldiers. Due to the high rate of fire and large ammo capacity, it could produce fire suppressions and superiority in shorter ranges. The PPSH-41 would see extended service in the Korean and US-Vietnam War. Other smaller conflicts would also see this weapon utilized. Many warehouses of the Eastern Bloc still have them, oiled and stored, should the situation arise. When the separatist militias in eastern Ukraine started to arm themselves, one could spot PPSH-41s among the soldiers. Either for propaganda purposes or for actual combat, this weapon still shines, 80 years after being introduced into the service. It's disputable how efficient this weapon can be nowadays. The previous common ranges for urban combat of only a couple dozen meters between troops in World War II have been largely replaced by a ranged combat of up to 300 meters in modern warfare. Assault rifles have mostly pushed out submachine guns, having stronger, more accurate, and deadly calibers. Additionally, assault rifles have so proliferated that it's now much easier to obtain one than an out-of-date submachine gun. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that World War II submachine guns are not needed anymore. On the contrary, the younger brother of the PPSH-41, another submachine gun created by Alexei Sodayev in 1943, also saw service in Donbass. This submachine gun, named the PPS, was designed to provide simple and effective personal defense weapons for gun and vehicle crews, reconnaissance and support units. It used the same 7.62 by 25mm Tokoraph cartridge as the PPSH-41 in a 35-round detachable box magazine. This weapon was crude, easy to produce, and was produced in millions of copies. Its advantage over the PPSH-41 was its foldable stock, which made it easier to use in cramped compartments of vehicles as well as trench warfare. Although it didn't fully replace the PPSH-41, but rather complemented it, it would see service in the later wars and conflicts, just like its older brother, as it was more reliable, had a pistol grip, and generally it was easier to use. Overall, it was a practical, functional, and cost-effective weapon. Some separatist forces in eastern Ukraine manned the barricades in Donbass, although the actual use and efficiency is doubtful, given ranges at which combat is taking place and the general advantage of assault rifles and other modern weapons. Both of these weapons would use the aforementioned 7.62 by 25mm Tokoraph cartridge. This cartridge is rather easy to obtain, as even the popular and mass-produced Tula Tokoraph 33 also uses it. This pistol is commonly known as the TT, or simply Tokoraph. It was designed in 1930 by Fyodor Tokoraph as a service pistol to replace, by that time, the old Nagant M1895 revolver, but it turned out to be a supplement to the Nagant rather than its obvious successor. The Tokoraph has an 8-round detachable magazine, simple and reliable mechanisms and design. It fires quite powerful cartridges, which in turn has a flat trajectory and increased penetration capabilities. The gun is renowned for its reliability and had served in many wars after its production ended in 1955. It's not surprising that it was one of the first guns to show up after the conflict broke out in Ukraine. Pistols were not that hard to obtain, and ammunition was readily available. Members on all sides are using it, making its war record continuing well into the 21st century. However, what has been mentioned have been more or less typical military firearms. Something extraordinary also showed up in this conflict: the World War II anti-tank rifles of the Soviet design. Anti-tank rifles were the product of the First World War, or to be more precise, as a countermeasure for the introduction of Allied tanks. They were big, cumbersome rifles designed to fire a large bullet and penetrate the armor of the tanks. Many European nations continued to build them into the interwar period. The Soviet Union had two rifles at their disposal. One of them, the PTR D41, was hastily constructed in 1941 to fill in shortages and provide Soviet infantry with some sort of defense against the tanks. It was a single-shot rifle firing a 14.5 by 114mm cartridge. This cartridge was originally developed for the PTR D41 and PTRS anti-tank rifles, but it's still being used up until this day in numerous roles. Back in 1941, it was more than capable of defeating the side armor of lighter German tanks, self-propelled guns, and half-tracks in the early stages of the German invasion. Moreover, it could potentially tear apart tank tracks and damage tank optics and other equipment. Used against enemy personnel, it was also very potent, as the rifle could deal significant damage to people, as well as soft-skinned vehicles and buildings. After the end of World War II, the rifles were phased out and used in limited amounts in several later conflicts. The introduction of RPG-2 and later anti-tank rocket launchers made this type of weapon obsolete. It was too big, too heavy, made too much noise, and other vehicles and weapons could fire the same cartridge in bigger and more accurate salvos. But its story didn't end there. In Donbass, there were instances, especially early in the war, where militia members would use this weapon against Ukrainian troops and equipment. This was despite the fact that the rifle itself is some 80 years old. It is capable of penetrating or seriously damaging armored personnel carriers and other lightly armored vehicles. Furthermore, the PTR D41 was also used in sniping activities. With its large round, a whole 1 kilometer of range, and penetration capabilities, this weapon could annihilate enemy dugouts, bunkers, control posts, and entrenchments. As a matter of fact, some are equipped with the thermal scope, muzzle suppressor, and a rail mount, making it a formidable anti-material rifle. With such a long range and devastating power, it had proved to be a good weapon even by today's standards. On the other hand, one disadvantage that the rifle has is that it's a single-shot weapon. The next 1941 anti-tank rifle was the PTRS-41. While the PTR-D41 was developed by Vasily Dectarov, the second one was made by Sergei Simonov. The main difference was that Simonov's rifle was a semi-automatic one with a magazine capacity of 5 rounds. This rifle was used with the same pattern and same success as its PTR-D41 precursor. The prime targets were lightly armored vehicles and tanks, personnel, transport vehicles, and fortifications. However, during the Ukrainian war, this rifle had found yet another purpose: fighting against low-flying helicopters or drones. Some have even been pictured or filmed fired from the back of a supporting soldier, or even with the shooter standing up, shoulder firing. Even though the rifle itself is some 20 kilograms, the shooter was somehow capable of firing it from the shoulder. Another dreaded World War II weapon was the Dectarov machine gun, or DP27. This weapon would have used the same 7.62 by 54mm cartridge as the Maxim gun, but weighed less and was easier to move around. Almost 800,000 have been produced, and it served in numerous conflicts, both in the 20th and 21st centuries. The Dectarov machine gun itself was quite reliable, which was not the case for its disc-shaped magazines. The gun would consequently be given nicknames such as the record player, due to the shape of the magazine resembling gramophone players. Called into the service of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, it was seen on the outskirts of Kyiv, among the territorial defense members manning checkpoints. After almost 100 years of service, it is striking that such a weapon can still find its use in modern conflicts. The crudeness and reliability of World War II designs made the weapons last incredibly long. Even though modern weapons surpass them in aspects such as quality, accuracy, rate of fire, ease of use, accessories, and others, they still find their way to the brutal front lines of war.